Because of the timing of Easter this year, in this week and a half in the build-up to Palm Sunday and Holy Week, we've celebrated three very special feast days. Last Wednesday we celebrated the Feast of St. Patrick, last Friday the Feast of St. Joseph. Now we come to the beautiful Feast of the Annunciation. I think on these three feast days there's very special, a very particular light that comes from a dynamic that we find in each of these feast days, that dynamic of a joyful response, a courageous response to God's call, cooperation with his plan of salvation. We see that in the most beautiful way in this Feast of the Annunciation, those words of Mary, "I'm the handmaid of the Lord, let it be done to me according to your word." We saw that same dynamic on the Feast of St. Joseph. St. Joseph wakes from sleep and does exactly as the angel of the Lord has asked him to do. And St. Patrick also, in his own way, responded to God's call, taking the light of the gospel, the sacraments, to the people of Ireland. I think there's a particular joy in these celebrations that comes from that light as we see a response to God's call, a cooperation with his light, with his plan of salvation. We maybe wonder, how did Mary, how did St. Joseph, how did St. Patrick find the courage to respond to God's call? For each of them, there were many questions, things that they didn't know, things that they didn't fully understand. How would this turn out? Where would this lead? But for all of those things that they didn't know, there's a light that comes from trust in God's goodness. The one thing that they needed was that trust, simply to know that they were in God's hands, and God's hands are good hands. The only thing they needed to know was that this was what God was asking of them. There's a wonderful sense of liberation and of peace that comes from that, each of them entrusting themselves into God's hands. "I'm the handmaid of the Lord, let it be done to me according to your word." On this feast day of the Annunciation, I think it's a beautiful day maybe to be inspired to pray for vocations to the religious life and to the priesthood in this archdiocese. It's maybe also a day for anyone who is wondering, is God calling me to the priesthood or to the religious life? Anyone who's wondering that, to take courage from the example of St. Patrick, of St. Joseph, of Mary in a particular way, to take courage from that, to know the only thing that matters is to respond to what God is asking of us. When we respond to God, then we're living in accordance with the truth of who we are. God created each one of us, so it makes absolute sense to listen, to want to know, to want to find out what it is that he asks of us, because it's only in responding to his call that we find who we truly are, that we're able to live with that light that he asks each one of us to bring into the world. Wish you all a happy feast day today, and it is a happy feast, that happiness that comes from being able to see Mary opening her life to God's plan of salvation, being totally open to God's will for her. And there's a happiness that comes to each one of us also only when we're able to do that. The small things of everyday life, responding as God wants us to respond, and also in the big decisions, those decisions as to what we're going to do with our lives. Is God calling me to the priesthood or to the religious life? To be able to say yes with courage, not because we know and understand everything, but because in responding to God's will, we know that we're surrounded by his strength. Wish all of you a happy feast day today.